Hello and welcome to HQ, where the lessons last a few minutes, but the learning lasts a lifetime. In today's lesson, we're going to go over the Revolutionary War and the causes that led up to it. Now, the reasons for this war breaking out are multifaceted, so I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that only one thing really led to it. There's a lot of parts in this, and we're going to look at these parts and they're going to lay out this road to revolution for us. So going back to the last video, and check it out if you missed it, it's a good one and helps really clarify things for this. The French and Indian War ended with Great Britain controlling Canada and the eastern half of North America, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. This war that created British hegemony in North America, though, came at a great cost, namely in money. It came at the cost of them doubling their debt and spending around 60% of their annual budget on interest on this debt. So the debt, and how the British end up paying for the debt, is the first part of our Road to Revolution series here. We really need to look at this first. The way Great Britain wanted to pay for this war was to tax the colonists, and this doesn't really seem that unreasonable, as the colonists were the ones who benefited from the war the most. In practice, though, this was really unfair, and for one large reason, and that's representation. According to this thing called British common law, British subjects could only be taxed by their direct representatives. And since these taxes came from Parliament, the colonists would need to have had representatives in Parliament for them to be represented and have their views shared on whether these taxes would be good or bad. And this is where our first problem comes, because these colonists do not have representation in Parliament. And this leads to a big hoopla with the phrase "no taxation without representation" coming into play. Because the colonists feel, and they're probably right in this, that the British are breaking the law by making them pay taxes that they are not represented in. These taxes include things like the Sugar Act, which affected the tax on molasses and sugar imports into North America, the Tea Act, which actually cut the price of tea in America, but colonists still didn't like it, the Townshend Acts, which are a way of raising money in the colonies, and the biggest one was the Stamp Act, which was purely to raise revenue. It required that pieces of paper, things like newspapers, magazines, playing cards, that kind of stuff, had to have a royal stamp on it, and the royal stamp was taxed. The colonists resisted these taxes because they felt like they were unfair. And this leads us to our second reason for revolution, which is the British reaction to the colonists' reaction to being taxed unfairly. The colonists felt like British taxation violated their rights as English citizens, rights they had not given up upon living in the New World instead of the Old, rights that they felt like were being trampled on by a now tyrannical government. So they resisted this apparent tyranny in their lives. One example of resistance, which I'm sure we all have heard of before, is the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty, a radical group of the time, led by men like Sam Adams and Paul Revere and James Otis, attacked British ships in Boston Harbor that were carrying tea. They took the tea, they dumped it in the harbor, and then they left. And this tea was not cheap. This is about $4 million worth of tea they dumped in the harbor. This is just one example of colonial resistance, by the way, to these acts of what they feel like is tyranny. The British reaction to this Boston Tea Party is something that's collectively known as the Intolerable Acts, where the British shut down Boston Harbor until the tea is paid for, which is a huge deal because it's one of the biggest ports in North America and puts a lot of people in work and makes a lot of money. They also take away Massachusetts' self-right to govern, or its charter essentially, saying that you can no longer govern yourselves, but the king is going to govern you. And finally, it puts hundreds of troops into Boston to try to keep a lid on everything that's going on. And it fails, though. This whole thing, however, really only stiffens the colonists' resolve as they see all of these things the British are doing as even more tyrannical acts. Another reason for the American Revolution to happen was the idea of natural human rights. And this idea came around during the Enlightenment period and was written down by a man named John Locke. John Locke wrote down that all men and women and children are entitled to certain rights, I guess you could call them, natural rights, rights that are given to you by God, not by a government. And these rights are life, liberty, and property, and that no government can deny you these rights. And if they do deny you these rights, then you have to change that government. And if this sounds familiar, it's because Thomas Jefferson pretty much copied that word for word in the Declaration of Independence. This idea of life, liberty, and property really influenced the colonists and made the British seem even more tyrannical because the colonists felt like they were being denied these rights. And again, like I said, Thomas Jefferson in his Declaration of Independence basically quotes this: life, liberty, property, but he calls it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So another reason for this revolution happening is that people are starting to have the idea that, hey, people are given natural rights when they are born, and if a government is denying you these rights, then that government has to change. And at this point in time in colonial America, people think their rights are being denied, these natural rights. Common sense is also another reason why the colonists decided to declare independence from Great Britain. Now, Common Sense was a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine, and it was focusing on British colonial relations. And its general idea was that the colonists need to separate from Great Britain. Through Common Sense, Thomas Paine lays out why America should be a separate nation from Great Britain. Common Sense also took upon the ideas of John Locke and laid out why America should be separate from Great Britain through natural rights. It said things like, our duty to mankind and to ourselves instructs us to end this alliance with Great Britain. And also one that's even more common sense, an island cannot perpetually govern a continent. That makes perfect sense, actually. An estimated 500,000 copies of Common Sense are sold, and it's a big reason why the ideas of liberty and independence spread from places that are boiling over like Boston to the colonies as a whole. Now, these are all leading up to our final reason for revolution, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Now, the Battle of Lexington and Concord was the shot heard around the world and set off the spark that lit the fuse that blew up the entire American colonies away from Great Britain. And it all started because of, again, this theme of tyranny. The colonists thought that the only way to protect themselves from a tyrannical government was to have arms and munitions. And when the British government sent soldiers to seize those arms and munitions, the colonists saw it as a government taking away their only way to protect themselves. So what did they do? They fought back. And this is the biggest step towards revolution. No longer is it philosophical. It's now an actual fighting war. Thomas Paine says it best: the period of debate is closed. Arms, as the last measure, decide the contest. The appeal was the choice of the king, and the continent hath accepted the challenge. Anyway, this is HQ, signing off for now. I'll see you next time.